Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 201 of Humanity Rising. You will probably note the orchids over my left shoulder. They came yesterday from a local florist as a gift to Humanity Rising. And I just want to thank all of you for your outpourings of support and enthusiasm and affirmation for what we're seeking to do here. Is day by day, we create an open space for people literally from around the world. We have registrations from over 130 different countries. And we go out each day live to thousands of people with a simple motivation to enable people to come together, to share their experiences, to share their aspirations, their concerns, as we all navigate through this extraordinary human experience of dealing collectively and simultaneously with this coronavirus pandemic, which started about a year ago, is continuing to plague us in different parts of the world and in different ways. So Humanity Rising is just an offering by Ubiquity University and now over 350 partners worldwide to enable us to establish and form a community of goodwill and intent. And these orchids represent that purity of intent. So thank you. Thank you very much. We want to start today on a rather sober note. On the 5th of March, just a few days ago, a young woman in India was killed by her father. I did not see it in the news, but Angie Azur, one of our doctoral students at Ubiquity, brought it to my attention yesterday. And I thought it would be a good opportunity both to note the multiplicity of the world. There's a lot of goodness in the world, but there's a lot of shadow. There's a lot of wickedness. There's a lot of intolerance. And particularly on a day when we're going to be talking about national security and rethinking national security, it seemed to us that it would be good to note, as we did a year ago in May, the killing of George Floyd, to note the killing of a young woman in India. So I'd like to introduce Angie Azur, who will tell us the story and then lead us in a meditation of commemoration. Angie?
Good morning. As Jim said, I am a doctoral student at Ubiquity University, and I'm writing a paper on Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola-Estes. And when I saw this report of this young woman, this young girl, 17, beheaded by her father in what is called an honor killing in India, it spoke to the little girl in me. It spoke to that fear of my small soul. And when I went into that, allowed myself to go into that fully, what I felt was complete rage in my larger soul. And it touched me so deeply that I reached out to Jim and just asked him, I needed help. I needed help from the masculine to hold this space of this rage I was feeling, that the feminine, this harm that comes to the feminine on this planet in this way. And this young girl who was honoring her wild side, honoring her wild nature, honoring her young sexuality, her life taken by her own father because of his shame, and calling it an honor killing. In this moment, I want to remember her, but in the news, they don't give her name, they give his. So I don't know her name, and so I meditated on her name. I wanted a name to call out, and Maya came to me, and I don't know that name. But this morning when I woke up and I researched what it meant, it's an old Sanskrit name, it's an Indian name, and it means illusion, and it means magic. And so it felt so true that Maya was speaking to me, and not only Maya, the young 17-year-old who was killed on March 5th, but all the Mayas that have been harmed, all the Mayas that are inside wanting to release that wildness of them that are afraid. My Maya, yours. And so I asked for the masculine to hold this space for the feminine, for the fear of coming out and being wild, for the fear of safety. But I also want to honor the ones who harm, compassion for those that feel that's the only way, their only path. That father and all those who have done this because of societal demands or wrong teachings. I want to send compassion to that energy. And then for Maya, for the one that is not named, I want to send love and freedom and honoring of this sister who fell. And I would like to take a moment of silence for all of those that have come before her and have fallen. So please join me in honoring the Mayas of the world and in sending compassion to those that have harmed them. And I think together we can change this vibration and we can start to really honor each other.
Thank you, Angie, for that beautiful poetic commemoration. I'm profoundly moved by your words of compassion for all the players in the drama. And I want to just thank you for bringing it to our attention. And is there any final words you would like to share or say to us today?
I feel that the field is holding this and that it is expanding me in a way that I feel more freedom to honor my wildness, and that my wish is for all of you to honor your wildness through this act, and to send compassion to those that have harmed you, and to really send love to those that have been harmed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, it's a deep thing, everyone, this challenge of feeling compassion for not only Maya, who's now passed into another realm, but the young man who was probably feeling the same poignancy of love and eros and in the springtime. Imagine what it's like to be 17 in love, the tragedy, the Romeo and Juliet quality to some loves, compassion for the Father. You think of the words of Jesus, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. They know not what they do. Those were the last words of Jesus on the cross, as the people with the same mentality as Maya's father nailed him to a tree. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Today, we're going to explore national security. And it's just worth noting, I think, as we begin this discussion, which is normally relegated to affairs of state and government policies, that the people who articulate national security have largely over history been people with the mentality of Maya's father. The willingness to kill, the willingness to oppress and exploit. And given the machinations of the human mind, to be able to do that and to call it security. That in some way we feel more secure when we have the power to make others feel insecure. And we call that peace. And today we want to challenge that notion. Last week we spent a whole week challenging our notion of peace as not an absence of violence, not an absence of conflict, of war, but as a proactive disposition of being from the inside out. That, as Angie just demonstrated before us all, can hold the evil within the context of the good and thereby manifest a spirit of compassion to all sentient being, whatever their role in the drama of life. So I'd like to introduce everyone to Glenn Anderson. Glenn Anderson has been on the front lines of social justice and social activism for many, many decades, starting with the Vietnam War and through the environmental movements and up to and including most recent protests here in the United States around George Floyd and various other incidences of global and national concern. So we're going to be talking about national security, not from the position of power, but from the position of compassion. So Glenn, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising. I will turn the program over to you, and I'd love you to start by just telling us your narrative, telling us a little bit about who you are and your journey and why it is that after all these decades on the front lines of social justice, you're grappling with the issues of rethinking national security. Welcome to our program.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I appreciate the user friendliness of everybody who got this thing up and running. This presentation, the Jim Garrison and the other folks involved have been very supportive, and that's the kind of modeling behavior we need to do for how we interact in the world. I want to thank Angie for opening up a pathway toward compassion and universality. Again, that's compatible with the message that I want to share with folks today. As Jim said, I became active in the peace movement during the 1960s with the Vietnam War and concern for the civil rights movement and all the other stuff that has been going on then and since. All of the international conflicts that could have been handled better, and all of the domestic social and economic injustices that need to be resolved in better ways. And so I've always been very much grounded in the profoundly nonviolent, principled aspects of the movement rather than at a superficial political level, although I can do that as well. But it's important that we bring our best values forward. And I'm a conscientious objector from the Vietnam era, and I still hold those beliefs. And I've been trying to practice things ever since then. I do a lot of speaking engagements and writing and so forth, and grassroots organizing about a range of issues. And a lot of what we have to be doing is rethinking the stuff that's been handed to us, where people say, this is just the way things are. You need to fit into the current paradigm. And really what we need to do is open things up to fresh ways of understanding. And so that's what I want to do with us today. I call this presentation here, Rethinking National Security. And I want to start by just saying that politicians keep promising to increase our, quote, national security, unquote, but usually that is just glib rhetoric. It's a euphemism for a bigger military and more weapons. Actually, the national security slogan is simplistic and limited and deceptive. It totally ignores what our nation and the world need in order to become truly secure. So although I'm speaking as somebody who's lived in the US all my life, the message here is not limited to how the US sees national security, because pretty much all of the nations of the world are buying into that traditional notion. So this really is a fairly universal concept. I want to help us rethink what national security should mean. And so there are three parts here in what I'll be saying. One is that our traditional assumptions about national security are simplistic, unethical, and they really have failed us. They've not made us secure. We could blow up the world at any moment with nuclear weapons in the name of national security. Number two is actually a peaceful and just foreign policy would make our nation and our world a lot more safe and secure. And thirdly, at the end of the presentation here, I want to lay out a concept of true security that would make our nation and the whole world more secure. And it involves rethinking it from a narrow nationalistic, egocentric standpoint toward what's good for everybody. So my first main point is that our traditional assumptions about national security are simplistic, unethical, and they really have failed us. So we have to rethink the concept of national security in totally fresh ways. Traditionally, the national security slogan has been so simplistic that it actually distracts us from smart thinking. It prevents us from creating public policies that would be ethical and effective. And so instead of mere, quote, national security, unquote, I would support a peaceful and just foreign policy that goes beyond narrow nationalism. And whether it's from the US's perspective or any other nation's nationalistic perspective. Security is not a zero-sum game in which one nation makes itself secure by making other nations insecure. No nation can make itself truly secure without also supporting the true security of all other nations. We can be secure only if we treat all other nations fairly in every way and help all nations feel truly secure. So instead of defining security as a huge military, which is the default, we must understand the concept of security in a more broader and holistic way. All of the world's nations need all kinds of security, including equal human rights for all kinds of people, all races, all religions, and so forth. And all nations need fairness in all of the national economies and the global economy. And we also need sustainable ecosystems and climates and so forth. We are not secure when ecosystems or climate problems exist anywhere. So a nation can be secure only if we recognize that here on planet Earth, we are all in this together, and that our security and well-being depend on all other nations' security and well-being. For a long time, the United States has utterly failed to recognize this humane global reality. Our foreign policy has used our military to serve the US government's geopolitical interests and American business interests in other parts of the world. Our foreign policy has relied on threatening military violence, conducting wars, overthrowing governments, including a number of democracies that the United States government and business elites did not like. The US's wars have hurt American people too in many ways. A few days ago, I was downtown holding a sign about nuclear weapons, and a homeless guy came by and made the connection, of course, that I understood right away between the billions we spend on nuclear weapons versus the government's decision that it's okay for poverty and homelessness to be widespread and increasing. So as I said, traditionally, the United States has thought about national security as a zero-sum game in which we increase our own security by making other nations less secure. And that really has turned many nations and portions of their population into enemies and terrorists. So our traditional foreign policy has actually made us less secure. And many people around the world recognize that the United States really is a terrorist nation because we're threatening to blow them up with bombs or nuclear weapons if they don't do what we tell them to do. So in order to become more secure, we have to help other nations become more secure by respecting their sovereignty, by respecting their health, their human rights, their economic justice, their ecosystems, and so forth. We have to become friends with all of the nation's ordinary people, not just their political elites, not just their military elites and their business elites. If we would become friends with other nations' ordinary people, they would not want to hurt us and we would be more secure. The national security slogan has traditionally been defined by the military-industrial complex for their own self-serving benefit. The military and the weapons manufacturers and their supporters in Congress, who are largely funded by the big military-industrial complex corporations, pretend that more weapons and military interventions make us more secure, but actually they make us less secure. Weapons manufacturers have enormous amounts of wealth, and they donate very generously to political candidates of both political parties, and they spend huge amounts of money lobbying Congress, the White House, and federal agencies. So as a result, the military has been taking more and more of our tax dollars, and currently more than half of the discretionary budget that Congress has the power to decide how to spend. This has shortchanged all other kinds of spending, things that ordinary Americans and ordinary people in other countries need for people's own security. Our health, food, housing, education, jobs, environmental protection, and so forth. The Pentagon and our nuclear weapons cannot protect us from the worst dangers. The climate crisis threatens the lives and the well-being of everybody on Earth. Military weapons cannot protect us from the climate crisis. The US military as an entity is actually the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. So our military has made the climate crisis much worse. Also, the United States government forced the other nations of the world at the Kyoto Climate Conference to exclude from counting the greenhouse gases emitted by military activities, fighter planes, battleships, whatever, outside of their own national boundaries. So the climate crisis is much worse because the US military is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, but the United States prevented the rest of the world from counting them as the Kyoto climate protocol was being worked out. So we're in denial about that. Also, military spending wastes money that we should be spending on real solutions to the climate crisis, but the real solutions keep getting downplayed. And the United States, under both political parties, has been escalating military spending and spending for nuclear weapons. We spend more now on nuclear weapons than we did at the peak of the Cold War. Also, the coronavirus pandemic is killing many people, especially in the United States, which has the very worst rate of infections in the entire world. The US has the biggest military in the world, but no amount of troops, no amount of weapons, no amount of nuclear weapons could have protected us from the pandemic or from future pandemics that are gearing up and will be inflicted upon the world at some point. So our nation is not secure when 500,000 Americans are homeless. Tens of millions of Americans have no health care. Pollution is hurting our environment, and pollution is hurting our public health. Politicians and business leaders say nice words about the environment and the climate, but they really are refusing to take the actions that everybody recognizes are necessary. Politicians fail to provide funding for what people need, such as anti-poverty programs, education, decent housing, healthcare, and environmental cleanup. Instead, we need a truly peaceful foreign policy, and we need to practice nonviolence throughout all aspects of society worldwide. Our foreign policy is fundamentally violent, and to rethink national security in a humane way, we need to have a truly nonviolent foreign policy. So if your only tool is a hammer, you're going to treat every problem as if it's a nail. And for many decades, the United States has relied so much on militarism that we've neglected honest diplomacy and nonviolent ways of solving problems, all the way down to excessive violence in local policing. And the public is finally saying enough of that stuff. War has a terrible track record. In every war, if two nations are fighting, at least one of them will lose. And very often, both nations end up losing in a variety of ways, lives, damage, and so forth. Very often, a nation that lost a war armed itself again in order to start the next war for revenge. And a good example is Germany in World Wars I and II, or the racists in the United States who still fly the Confederate battle flag now, 150 years after the US Army decisively defeated the Confederate Army in our nation's Civil War. And 150 years later, we still have a lot of Americans flying the Confederate battle flag because they resent the loss of the war that was designed to protect slavery in the South. War does not solve problems, and the Civil War did not defeat racism. If we want to defeat racism, we have to do it in other ways. Americans and our government need to use diplomacy and other nonviolent ways of solving problems. Other nations also, if you live someplace else, you'll recognize how this might pertain to your nation as well. In conflict situations, nonviolence actually has been proven to work better than efforts that include violence. If you want more information about this, contact me and I can provide references of things that you can read about nonviolence. And I also conduct free online workshops about this. I invite you to see information about these kinds of things at various parts of my blog, which is www.parallaxperspectives.org, including categories for peace, international affairs, nuclear weapons, terrorism, military spending, and nonviolence. So the second main point here for this morning is that a peaceful and just foreign policy would make us more safe and secure. A worldview that's based on nationalism and empire has persisted really for thousands of years in many parts of the world, not all parts of the world, but many parts of the world. And the worldview about nationalism and empire has really dominated US foreign policy for more than a century. Both of our big political parties assume that militaristic nationalism is just fine. And since we have bipartisan agreement on the value of militaristic nationalism, is not a contentious issue, so it's not an issue up for public debate unless folks like us raise that issue. And the news media like to report on things that are in conflict, but militarism is not really in conflict at the national political level. So the news media in this country do not raise that issue and get a thorough discussion going. So instead of accepting the status quo as just the way things are, we have to challenge the status quo and we have to solve the longstanding problems. Many sensible, humane people around the world want peace, human rights, and fairness. I'm one of them. And I would bet that everybody else on this program here today is too. If we were to ask the public whether they want peace, nearly everybody would say yes. But violence and war have become so normalized that people think war is the way to achieve peace. In fact, the U.S. Air Force Academy at Colorado Springs, Colorado, has at their big opening front gate the slogan, "Peace is our profession." These are the people who are willing to blow us up in a nuclear war with land-based missiles and nuclear bombs dropped from airplanes. So I truly believe that at a deep level, most Americans and most people in other countries around the planet would prefer better values that are humane, compassionate, peaceful, fair to everybody, and environmentally sustainable. And I like what the World Social Forum has affirmed years past. Another world is possible. And yes, we really can imagine a better world, and we can work with other people, including the people who are on this conversation here today, to bring another world into being. And that's what we have to be doing creatively and with good hearts. So I want to lay out some alternatives to the dominant assumptions. I want to expose 6 dominant assumptions, and I want to propose that we make their opposites our new public policy. One is polarizing into us versus them and fearing them does not work, but that's how things go in the world. And instead, we have to recognize that all people are one human family and that our safety and everyone's safety depends on helping all people feel safe. Number 2 is that the United States is not entitled to dominate or bully other nations. And actually, no nation should dominate or bully other nations. We would be more secure on this planet if we promoted compassion, fairness, and cooperation among all nations with an egalitarian spirit instead of a hierarchical sense based on military power. Number 3 is that violence does not solve problems. Violence only makes problems worse. We need to devise nonviolent solutions to all of our various kinds of problems. Number 4 is everything is interconnected. So when the United States treats other nations badly, that bad karma returns to us in what actually for decades the CIA has called blowback. The United States' mistreatment of other nations causes people to flee those nations as refugees and destabilize the nations that they move into. This is a concern of the nations that are receiving refugees or refusing to receive refugees. And this is not only the United States, but nations elsewhere. And although I certainly welcome refugees, it's disruptive unless the nations are willing to be receptive and welcoming and egalitarian when people need to move there because of whatever conditions in their countries of origin. Also, the United States' bad behavior in other nations causes people to feel anger at the United States and cause terrorist violence. So I don't support terrorism, but we need to understand what the roots are. And the roots go back to how the United States has been treating other nations and populations within those nations. So instead of, number 5 here is, instead of assuming zero-sum games with winners and losers, let's recognize that we're all in this together and plan how to nonviolently achieve win-win solutions. And number 6 is, let's replace the United States self-centered, ineffective national security model with an egalitarian, compassionate, true security model that I'll flesh out near the end of this presentation here. That'll be part 3. Right now we're in part 2 of this presentation. So I want to flesh out some alternatives that I mentioned to those 6 old assumptions that I said, instead of the dominant current assumptions of the status quo, let's flip them to the opposites. So I talked, number 1 was about polarizing to us and them, and instead we have to recognize that all people are one human family, and everybody's security and safety depends on helping all people feel safe. And for a long time, we've been polarized and thinking about us versus them. Oppressors polarize us by nationality, just like oppressors polarize us by race, religion, sexual orientation, economic class, and other factors. Oppressors use this divide and conquer strategy in order to keep oppressed people down. So we have to reject the polarization and affirm that all people are one human family. And that way we can affirm that we're all in this together, and the vast majority of people can rise up nonviolently and change the status quo toward a more humane, peaceful world instead of having endless wars. Number 2 was that the United States is not entitled to dominate or bully other nations, nor should any other nation dominate or bully any other nation. And we would be more secure if we practiced compassion, fairness, and cooperation among all nations. And a long-standing problem within the United States is our mistaken notion that the U.S. is the beacon of liberty, and that the United States is so righteous and so blessed by God that we are entitled to dominate the world. And this is the notion of American exceptionalism that causes many Americans and our government to think that the United States is exempt from international law and other realities. Some people in the US think that we are exempt from the laws of science and the climate crisis. Nationalism and American exceptionalism allow powerful Americans to feel entitled to exploit other people of the world and rip off their natural resources. We need to recognize that other nations' people have the right to determine what to do with their natural resources. And that's the ordinary people of those nations, not their economic elites or not the US's elites, but the people themselves have a right to determine what to do with their natural resources. So we have to reject the cynical militaristic assumption that might makes right and instead support honest, profound ethics. We need to replace militarism with an egalitarian worldview that seeks every person's well-being through nonviolent methods. Number 3 that I mentioned that we need to flip is that violence does not solve problems. Violence only makes problems worse. And the real remedy for problems is nonviolence. And if you look at many movies, whether it's Westerns, crime movies, spy movies, or whatever, they end with a big shootout or big explosion or some other cataclysmic violence at the end. And in these fictional movies, violence solves the big problem. And this has been called the myth of redemptive violence. And the myth of redemptive violence is the wishful thinking that underlies our militaristic foreign policy. Just like fictional movies, we pretend that violence will solve our problems. If we can just bomb Syria one more time, that'll solve the problem. If we can just do this, that'll solve the problem. No, that doesn't do it. It just keeps the cycle of violence going. We waste hundreds of billions of dollars on endless, unwinnable wars that only make problems worse because of the widespread and mistaken assumption that violence solves problems. And the United States is especially guilty of that, but other nations have done this too in various ways. Not all nations, but let's help people understand that the real problem is violence itself. And that's true at the national and international levels. It's true at the local domestic level. It's true within families and so forth. We have to create a foreign policy that affirms truth, fairness, and peace, we have to commit to nonviolent ways of solving problems at both international and domestic levels. If you want to do a fun exercise, get together with some friends and think, what would a nonviolent economy look like? What would nonviolent ways of raising kids look like? What would a nonviolent school system look like? And so forth. What would nonviolent policing look like? That would be a fun discussion to have with your friends. Number 4 is that everything is interconnected. So when the United States treats other nations badly, that bad karma returns to us as blowback. And the CIA developed that term blowback in the 1950s because they could see that was already happening. And of course, we know that's been happening since then. The United States' mistreatment of other nations causes people to retaliate in various ways against the United States, but also our mistreatment of other nations makes it impossible for them to make a living as farmers or as whatever people that need to make a living somehow. And if they can't do it, they'll move. And that disrupts internationally because a lot of nations don't want to accept refugees. But let's solve the problems at the roots rather than have disruptive flows of populations that we need to help people be able to function and survive sustainably in their own countries, or if they choose to move, that's fine too. But when we study the environment, we learn that everything is interconnected. No animal or plant or body of water can pretend that it is isolated from other parts of its ecosystem. Neither can we practice isolationism from other nations. We have to interact with other nations based on fairness and diplomacy instead of exploitation and war. And whatever we do to other nations produces feedback loops. When we treat other nations unfairly, we provoke feedback loops that hurt the United States. Some religious traditions refer to karma. Whatever we do comes back to us as sort of a universal law of how the universe functions. So more than half a century ago, the Pentagon and the CIA recognized that people elsewhere would retaliate against the United States because of bad things our nation has done to them. And blowback really is the CIA term for bad karma. The United States' greed, exploitation, and other sins against the Earth's environment also come back to hurt us in the form of the climate crisis and refugees who have to flee from environmental devastation and the dictatorships that the United States has, in many cases, imposed upon them or supported. We have to stop grabbing more than our fair share of the world's natural resources. We have to stop using threats and violence against other nations. If the United States would start behaving ethically, responsibly, and nonviolently, we could create friends instead of enemies, and we would not feel the need to spend $700 billion or more every year on military weapons and military troops and all of that stuff. We'd be able to solve global problems through diplomacy, mediation, and other nonviolent methods. Number 5 was instead of assuming a zero-sum game with winners and losers, let's recognize that we're all in this together and let's figure out how to nonviolently achieve win-win solutions. The assumption that underlies our foreign policy is that the United States is good and any nation that our government disagrees with is evil. Therefore, we feel justified in using violence, but they are not allowed to defend themselves from our attacks. Anytime when individuals or groups or nations are in conflict, each side sees the conflict in absolute terms from its own perspective and does not understand the other side's perception of reality or what the other side needs. Each new act of violence by either side only reinforces the other side's fear and anger and judgmentalism. And then it feels self-righteous in using violence to start or retaliate in a cycle that will certainly end badly. In this cycle of violence, each side justifies its own violence while at the same time denounces the other side's use of violence. So the problem of violence itself is the problem when we're trapped in this kind of a cycle. And we have to get out of that with honest diplomacy that includes good listening and respect for other people's legitimate needs. Many of our nation's political, economic, and social problems were caused by a shortage of empathy, a failure to recognize our common humanity and the legitimate needs of people other than ourselves. We have to replace selfishness and oppression with a humble appreciation for every person's inherent value, dignity, and rights. We can solve problems through empathic listening, objective criteria, and even-handed justice, including respect for international law, which a number of nations, especially the United States, routinely violate. Some people think that we who want peace are naive, but for thousands of years, wars have only led to more wars. World War I was promoted by its supporters as the war to end all wars. Has it produced peace in the 100 years after 1918? The people who actually are naive and realistic are those who think that military violence will solve problems after thousands of years of having military violence fail to solve problems. So number 6 in my list of things we need to flip is we have to replace the United States' selfish, ineffective national security model with the egalitarian, compassionate, true security model that I'll flesh out in just a moment here as part 3 of this presentation. Let's see. I can skip this because I've already said that. We have to replace fear and animosity with love and compassion. We have to replace raw power with profound justice and peace. The whole world is afraid of violence, but ironically, it is militarism itself that actually causes much of the world's violence. And militarism itself is a root cause of people's fears and lack of security. So instead of promoting national security, militarism makes us less secure. We have to reduce the military budget to a tiny fraction of what it is now and use the financial savings to help people become truly secure by ending poverty, providing everybody with education, safe drinking water, good health care, a sustainable environment, and a safe climate. Demilitarizing would help everybody be safe and secure. And I invite people again to see the categories for peace and nonviolence on my blog, parallaxperspectives.org. Parallax has 1 R and 2 L's, parallaxperspectives.org. So here's the third main point. We have to replace the traditional concept of national security because it is simplistic, narrow, cruel, and actually it hurts us. We have to replace it with true security. And this part of the thing I wrote soon after the attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001. And a friend of mine also generated some of the ideas. So this is a composite. True security cannot be won by weapons. Actually, true security is rooted in social and economic justice, civil liberties, a vibrant democracy, a healthy environment, and humane values. The American people are afraid of terrorists. I wrote this again soon after September 11, 2001. But Americans also have deep and troubling fears about the crumbling economy, the loss of civil liberties, the deteriorating environment, the future of our kids and our grandkids. For many decades, and regardless of which party was running the government in the US, the consistent pattern has been to escalate and manipulate the American people's fears in order to increase the government's own power and to serve big business and the United States' global empire. But ironically, that very power grab, the militarization and the centralization of power, are actually among the root causes of people's legitimate fears in the first place. The public really does have valid reasons for fearing the loss of our economic security, our health security, our environmental security, our civic and voting security, and other kinds of security. But those losses of security come partly because of the dominant worldviews that I've been explaining throughout this presentation here. Most Americans know that we really are being pushed downward. We are losing our retirement plans. We're losing our access to healthcare, our quality of life, our environment, truth, and fairness in the media, honest political processes, and so forth. And this is not in my original thing, but in light of recent events in the United States, when people fear that they're losing, they get defensive and they want to say, we white people need to protect ourselves against people who are not white, or we conservative Christians need to protect ourselves against people who are not conservative Christians, and people do things like what we've seen in the last 4 years with Trump and the continuing escalation toward cruelty that really comes from people's fears, but those fears have been misplaced. And so people, having diagnosed the problem wrong, are seeking the wrong remedies. So thoughtful people could help our nation understand what we really need, what would really make us secure, and we can redefine true security, promote progressive alternatives to the status quo, take the moral and political high ground, and we can win the public over to our side if we can articulate these and tap into people's real needs and create a better, more secure future. People want security, but we can't gain true security through wars. We can't gain true security by sacrificing our civil liberties. True security has to be based on peace, social and economic justice, a sustainable environment, a vibrant economy, civil liberties for everybody, and all of the other progressive values. We can organize nonviolent grassroots movements from the bottom up to help us gain many kinds of security. And I do conduct free online workshops about how to organize nonviolent grassroots movements. But we need to look for the kinds of security that people will want, such as economic security, like job security, living wages, job safety, cures for poverty, help during hard times, protection from dangerous working conditions, secure retirement income, and so forth. These are all parts of economic security. People also have a right to look for food security. We need safe and nutritious food for everybody so we can end hunger and support local farmers and local retailers. We need health security, access to high quality, affordable healthcare for everybody in our nation, respectful treatment, focus on preventing diseases, strong public health services, and so forth. We really can promote environmental security that people would actually appreciate if we can have it. Sustainable ecosystems, enough clean water, clean air, healthy forests, land use planning for sustainability, protecting all people and environments from toxics, protecting us from climate disruptions, and so forth. People want personal security, thoughtful and sensitive policies and services regarding child abuse, domestic violence, gender issues, human dignity for every kind of person, safety from substance abuse, and so forth. Community and cultural security would include respect for all cultures and languages, freedom to practice any religion or no religion, protections from businesses' power, big business power, accountability when big business abuses us, removing the underlying causes of crime, comfort walking anywhere at any time, ways to heal and reconcile when somebody hurts another person, and so forth. And finally, political security, which would include freedom from governmental oppression or abuse, support for civil rights and civil liberties, meaningful opportunities for all people to participate in the democratic process, and so forth. So these are the kinds of security that I believe people really would want. We need to articulate these and organize for these. And next, I will show on the screen here a table for true security at the global level. And just a second, I need to fix my notes just a bit here. I invite people to incorporate this kind of strategy when you work on the issues you care about. And let me scroll down here and do let's see, I need to bring up something different on a share screen that I think I have not yet brought up. Let's see. Well,
Len, do you want me to put it up?
yeah, bring it up. It'll look better from what I sent you. Will look better than this. If you can bring that up, that'll be helpful. So the table here was designed partly by a friend and partly from me. It's maybe kind of small, but you'll see that there are two main columns. One column says the typical American way to achieve national security, and the second column is better ways to achieve true security. And so you'll see rows labeled vision, axis of evil, goals, methods, and so forth. And the vision of the typical American way is national security, meaning United States dominates all of the countries. A better way to achieve true security is the United States cooperates fairly with all other countries. The axis of evil that George W. Bush and his propagandists put out linked Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And of course, those are not really an axis like the Axis powers in World War II. Those are countries that don't even get along with each other. But that was their propaganda from the Bush regime. But the better way to achieve true security is Martin Luther King never called any people evil, but he identified three evil systems, which are racism, militarism, and poverty. So let's go after the things that really are evil, as King had identified. The goals in the typical American way to achieve national security is national security against other nations, but the better way would be global security and equitable relationships among all nations. The typical American way for national security in the goal row is also political, military, economic, cultural dominance. But a better way for true security would be self-determination, economic well-being for all, respect for other cultures and religions, and so forth. Just a second, hold on. I need the phone muted down to nothing there. The methods, instead of the militarism, we go for diplomacy and so forth. You can just see down the list here. But this is the kind of concept that is shifting from the dominance to the alternative. So instead of the motivation being things like hatred, fear, power, and self-centeredness, it becomes love, compassion, faith, and justice. And the result is currently we have global chaos, but if we really had the true security model, we would have global community. So thanks for sharing that. That's fine. So that is basically my pitch, and I invite people to speak up. Jim or somebody, will you be facilitating the Q&A and the conversation? I'm hoping we can get a good discussion going here.
Yes, well, thank you, Glenn, very much. You've obviously spent a great deal of time thinking about this and working on the front lines of social change to implement it. And I'm just wondering what your sense of the current state of play. Do you think there's any hope for any of the points that you're raising, given the new Biden administration here in the United States? What's your assessment of possibilities now with a new administration?
Well, it's not as much as some people think, not as much as mainstream Democrats think, because the problems that we've had that I identified here really are bipartisan, going back a very, very, very long time. The nuclear weapons for 75 years have been strongly bipartisan. In Trump's most recent budget, Trump's final budget, the House Democrats gave Trump more money for the Pentagon than Trump had asked for. Both parties are vigorously funding a whole new major escalation of nuclear weapons. And Biden has never been a peace guy. He was a strong supporter of George W. Bush's Iraq War. Biden has never come out really well on peace things. He's appointed a huge number of really vicious military hawks to powerful positions in his administration. And so neither political party will save us from this bipartisan trap that we've been in for a long, long, long time. So, yeah, and I see somebody mentioned about Obama had advocated for $1.5 trillion to modernize the nuclear arsenal. When Obama had made a speech in Prague in 2009 saying we should abolish nuclear weapons, and he and Putin worked out the New START treaty. And when the time came for the Senate to ratify it, Senate Republicans said, no, we will not unless you fund nuclear weapons. And Obama let Senate Republicans fool him into authorizing and supporting a complete rebuild of all new nuclear weapons. So it really is the initial estimate was $1.2 trillion for the next few decades, and people say realistically that cost is going to escalate to close to 2 trillion. But it's so Obama allowed himself to be committed, and the Congress committed to funding all new nuclear warheads, all new nuclear missiles from land-based, all new submarine missiles, all new nuclear submarines themselves, all and bombers. I mean, the entire nuclear weapons arsenal is being rebuilt with new weapons that are designed to be deadlier and easier to use. And so instead of having this high threshold into, this would be a horrible thing to start a nuclear war, they're funding low yield nuclear weapons. Low yield meaning not quite as bad as Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, but they're designed to start a nuclear war to make it easier to trip over that lower threshold. But they've put these onto Trident nuclear submarines, which is our worst weapons. And if Russia or China or somebody sees a Trident submarine missile coming at them, they won't assume, oh, maybe it's only one of the small ones. They're going to assume it's the worst, and they're going to retaliate with everything. So these nuclear weapons are designed to be a tripwire that will provoke an all-out nuclear war. And Congress, bipartisan, went for it, and Biden is on board with all that stuff. And he bombed Syria now, and he's dragging his feet on rejoining the Iran nuclear deal, using Trump's thing, saying let's not do the Iran nuclear deal. Let's apply leverage and pressure. Oh, come on, this is so. The only way to change this is not by electing a Democrat. It's by having us folks on this conversation organize for really a profound change of our peaceful foreign policy.
Yeah, I think you're right. One of the books I wrote a number of years ago was called America as Empire. And I looked at the history of the United States from the point of view of the rise and fall of imperial systems. And the illusion of democracy, the illusion of freedom, the illusion that we're the light on the top of the hill has been used very effectively by a number of empires. It was the self-rationale for Rome, for Athens, the Athenian Empire, for the Chinese imperial tradition, the British, the whole notion of the white man's burden.
Right.
As Tacitus said of the Romans, they conquer, create a wasteland, and call it peace.
Yes.
And so I really want to acknowledge what you're saying, that this is not a matter of Democrat or Republican. This is a matter of a national, I would say, obsession for power that started at the very beginning of the American historical tradition. It's worth noting that as early as our second president, Thomas Jefferson, in 1803, he deployed troops and vessels in the Mediterranean Sea. And in 1823, under our fifth president, James Monroe, they declared the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, just think of the chutzpah for the United States, barely formed as a nation, declaring to the rest of the world that the entire Western Hemisphere, from Canada down to Chile, was the the zone in which the United States was going to exercise imperial power.
Right.
And the extraordinary thing is that the European powers acknowledged it. And we've been interceding in Latin America ever since.
Yeah.
So it's a real question, Glenn, that I would put to you. Given that systemic imperial trajectory, given the fact that it is so bipartisan.
Yeah, what we need is a change of consciousness as an alternative world.
How do we do that? How do we do that? How do we turn
your
the
program
game?
is one start. We're starting here. I've been doing workshops related to this stuff. A lot of good peace groups are out here. I'm noticing in the chat, people are suggesting some really good things. World Beyond War is a good organization. Somebody said we have some good members, good progressives in the U.S. House now. AOC and the Squad and some other folks. So we need to start in multiple ways wherever people are. I mean, there's potential within the religious community to rise up. Within your own faith community, there's the Lutheran Peace Fellowship, the Jewish Peace Fellowship, the Muslim Peace Fellowship, and Pax Christi. And I mean, there's people within different faith traditions. And, we have Physicians for Social Responsibility that does really good work. They mobilize not only medical professionals, but other people as well to work on peace and climate and so forth. So people can do all kinds of things. And I'm appreciating the good suggestions in the chat as well here.
Another
wisdom in there.
I think a model that's worth noting and looking at is the European Common Market. There is no region in the world more violent than Europe, particularly in the 19th and first half of the 20th century. And yet after the carnage of the Second World War that left 50 million people dead, and the Holocaust, Hiroshima, Nagasaki in Asia, the Europeans, in a very short period of time, came together because they had this change of consciousness. And declared that they were going to establish a zone of peace initially around coal and steel, but then growing very, very quickly and very naturally and with great enthusiasm across the length and breadth of Europe to form the common market, which is now, of course, the European Union. It's the first time in history where a group of warring states came together peacefully, not through coercion. And it's worth just noting that there's no examples in previous history, at least that I know about, where groups of nations came together without somebody conquering them. It's easy to establish Pax Romana if the Romans are conquering everybody, but this was the conquered and the conquering. The Allies and the Axis powers after the devastation of the Second World War that came together and establish a peace that endures to the present day. I mean, what do you make of that, and how could the United States learn from that?
Well, that's a good role model for us. I'm noticing in the chat somebody mentioned the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights here, and there's a link there. And this person in the chat said that should be taught in school. So that's something. There's one really exciting thing happening. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons now has 54 nations that have ratified it, almost all from the global south. Very few, only a couple nations in the global north ratified it. The Vatican was one of 3 nations that ratified it on the first day that it became available for ratification. Ireland ratified it. I don't know who else in the global north might have, but mostly it's global south nations. They're tired of being bullied. And the origin of this treaty that was approved by the United Nations General Assembly in July 2017 by 122 nations out of 193 in the UN General Assembly, approved it so it was available to head out for signing and ratification. That came about because we have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that since 1970 had this grand bargain between the nations that have nuclear weapons and the nations that do not. And currently, we have 9 nuclear nations. Back then, I think we had 5. And the grand bargain was, okay, the nations that do not have nuclear weapons promise never to acquire nuclear weapons. And the nations that do have nuclear weapons promise to get rid of them promptly. That was half a century ago. And then the most of the non-nuclear nations have complied with it. A few have acquired them. But the nuclear nations have been violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty since 1970 by not getting rid of our weapons. So when the periodic review meeting came up in 2010, it comes up every number of years for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the nations in the global south said, enough of that crap. We're going to consider coming up with a treaty that will prohibit nuclear weapons, since you guys are not fulfilling your obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so that was the origin of this. And it came largely from the global south, from nations that were sick and tired of being bullied by 9 nuclear nations. And so now we have 54 nations. And the idea there is to put pressure, not only moral pressure, but also economic pressure on the big nations. Because if your nation has ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, your nation is obligated to stop doing business with companies that have any hand in the nuclear weapons production. So there might be a machine shop in your company, in your country, that makes some component. Nope, can't do that. Or some, are they going to take seriously, we can't let our national airline use Boeing airplanes anymore because Boeing makes nuclear weapons. Are they going to have to stop using Boeing airliners for their national airline and so forth? So where's this going to go? So that's exciting. And we cover this in the course that I help teach about nuclear weapons nowadays. But anyway, that's something to look at. Look at the website for the national or the international organization that promoted the treaty. It's www.icanw.org, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Anyway, enough of me. I want to hear from other folks.
Well, thank you. We're coming to the end of our time, Glenn, but I want to thank you so much for the clarity with which you've illuminated both the need for national security reformation, but the depth to which the country has fallen that makes it essentially impossible without a radical change in consciousness, like Europe demonstrated in the 1950s and 1960s when they repented of war, as it were, and began to fashion what became the European Union.
Yeah, I want to give a quick answer to Franca, who put in the chat, what are the 3 real enemies: poverty, militarism, and what, according to whom? And the third one was racism. It was according to Martin Luther King. And he said this often. So Martin Luther King had said that the 3 real evils that we have are poverty, militarism, and racism. And that was Martin Luther King. And he said and wrote that a number of times.
Good. Thank you. And then tomorrow, everyone, we will focus on the 10th anniversary of the nuclear meltdown at Fukushima. It was 10 years ago this week that you will recall an earthquake shook Japan and the nuclear reactor right there on the coast of Japan, Fukushima, melted down. It's an accident that continues with us to the present day and is still unresolved. So 10 years on, we're bringing together some scientists and specialists in nuclear power and radiation to inform us of what the current status of the reactor is and what are the environmental and human challenges that we face. So that's tomorrow at the on Humanity Rising, same time, same station, 5:00 p.m. Central European Time. So Glenn, thank you so much for your wisdom today. And Angie, thank you so much for bringing to our attention the situation with Maya and the honor killings that are occurring even now in India, Pakistan, and around South Asia. I appreciated your sensitivity and the guidance for your words and your meditation. So thank you. And thank you, everyone. We'll see you here again tomorrow on Humanity Rising. And for those of you who can, please join us in the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. Thank you, everyone. Be well. Bye-bye.